For just pounds in the UK or pennies abroad, a common steroid has become the first drug in the world to be shown to save the lives of seriously ill COVID patients. Dexamethasone has been used for 60 years as an anti-inflammatory. Tonight, it was hailed by the Prime Minister himself as a breakthrough treatment.
I am proud of these British scientists, backed by UK government funding, who have led the first robust clinical trial anywhere in the world to find a coronavirus treatment proven to reduce the risk of death.
2,000 patients were given the treatment and they were compared with 4,000 others.
And what we saw was really quite remarkable. In ventilated patients with COVID-19, the drug dexamethasone, so 10 days of treatment with that, which is a tablet or an injection, reduces the risk of death by about 35%. In patients on the ward who require oxygen and have COVID, it reduces the risk of death by about 20%.
In fact, 1 in 8 patients on a ventilator and 1 in 25 patients requiring oxygen survived. And currently, 40% of those on ventilators do not live, so this could have an enormous impact. Dexamethasone was part of the recovery study, the largest COVID-19 trial in the world, looking at different treatments. But expectations for the steroid were low. It had little effect on SARS patients in 2003. At the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital, Derek Slack said he was very poorly and on oxygen when he was given the drug.
I was in hospital for the first 2 to 3 days. I was ill. And I don't say that lightly. I was ill. After the second day, third day, I was going, hey, what is this stuff?
Tonight, an alert will be sent to all hospitals saying it should be used where appropriate, and the government has also stockpiled the drug, placing it on the list, banning it from export.
So if we'd known this 4 or 5 months ago, we would have saved tens of thousands of lives, probably. But we're at the stage, we managed to get the result during the epidemic, and certainly before a second wave, but there's still very active disease in large parts of the world. It can start to be used from today, tomorrow, and we'll start saving lives, and I'm sure we'll save many thousands of lives.
There was some criticism tonight that the announcement was made before the trial data was published. There have been other drugs, notably hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, which initially caused excitement, only to be withdrawn. But there is a desperate race to find a treatment for a virus that has so far killed 450,000 people worldwide. And dexamethasone holds out the hope of not just being effective, but also affordable.
Well, the official number of UK deaths went up by 233 in the last 24 hours, taking the total number of people who have died to just under 42,000. We're joined now by Richard Horton, who's been editor of the Lancet Medical Journal for 25 years and has just written a book titled The COVID-19 Catastrophe, What's Gone Wrong and How to Stop It Happening Again. Richard Horton, I'll come to that in a minute, but first let's deal with this news story of a breakthrough about the steroid treatment. There was a bit of a false dawn over hydroxychloroquine. You had to retract a paper yourself. How optimistic are you that this really is a breakthrough?
Oh, yes, this is a turning point in the treatment of COVID-19. This is an incredible trial. This particular part of the trial is comparing 6,000 patients, over 6,000 patients, and the effects of dexamethasone are particularly important in patients who are ventilated, where death rates were cut by over a third. I mean, this is a major breakthrough, no question about it. And we should be thankful not just to the researchers who did this, but it was only possible to do this kind of trial because of the National Health Service.
But could you go so far as to say that this might vindicate the easing of the lockdown, that you're not going to be in so much danger of a spike in deaths?
It won't affect the potential for a flare-up, but what's important is that if we do get a flare-up and more patients are admitted to hospital and to intensive care units, we now have a treatment, a salvage treatment that can actually reduce the risk of death. We didn't have that before. That's a very important moment.
Let's talk about your description of government policy. Appalling misjudgments, you've said, by the government that caused tens of thousands of avoidable deaths. What do you say to people who say, look, we're in the middle of a global crisis here? Shouldn't you wait until after that's over to get the analysis and the criticism in?
Well, we need to learn the lessons now, because if we do have a flare-up or if we do have a second wave, we need to understand what we did wrong the first time round so we don't repeat those mistakes the second time round. So it's really, really important to examine in detail what mistakes we made. And clearly the earliest mistakes were we didn't pay attention to the evidence coming out of China in the very last week of January. We didn't lock down early enough. We didn't get PPE to the front line quick enough. And we didn't build a test, trace and isolate system at the very beginning, despite the fact that we've known for 3 or 4 years that we were not prepared for that. So we've got those lessons now in our hands. If we get a flare-up as we go into an influenza season at the end of the year, we will not make those mistakes again.
And do you lay those mistakes at the door of the scientists or the politicians, or both?
I think there was a combination of problems. The scientists were seeing this pandemic through the lens of influenza, whereas in China they were looking at the outbreak in terms of SARS, which is far more serious, a much higher mortality rate. So I think we went into this thinking we could treat it as in a fairly relaxed way as we do any influenza epidemic. In fact, if you remember, Boris Johnson talked about taking it on the chin. And that was his way of expressing this notion of herd immunity. And it was only when Lombardy became engulfed that we realized how serious it was. But if only our scientists had gone and talked to their Chinese counterparts in the last week of January, we would have understood how serious it was, because exactly what's happened here was happening in Wuhan and elsewhere in China 4 months ago.
You've been optimistic tonight about the prospect of a breakthrough with the steroid treatment. What about the vaccines that, a lot of people are very optimistic about? We might perhaps get them by Christmas. How optimistic are you about that?
Well, there are about 130 vaccine candidates now being investigated around the world, and we only sequenced the genome for this virus at the very beginning of January. That's a remarkable effort. 10 of these vaccines are now in human clinical trials. I think there's every prospect that over the next 6 to 12 months, we could have a vaccine that is available. Vaccine science is moving faster than it ever has done in human history. And we've got the possibility of having a vaccine by, I would say, early next year.